When reading about the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive of 1944, people wonder, why did the Allies manage to halt the Germans, but the French and the Belgians did not in 1940? Although the overall plans of attack seem similar on paper, a surprise attack in a weak sector to create an encirclement. There are major differences in reality, and in this video you're gonna learn about the German attacks through the Ardennes 1940 versus 1944. Let's start with the similarities. In 1940, in May, the Germans launched an attack through the hilly and forested Ardennes region. This sector was weakly defended by the French and Belgians. The Germans concentrated a powerful force to execute this attack. 7 of the 10 Panzer divisions and 3 of the 4 Heer motorized infantry divisions led the advance. In their wake followed the infantry divisions of Army Group A. The Allied intelligence service did not detect the attack. Subsequently, the Allied Supreme Command was slow to fully understand the situation and respond accordingly. The Germans reached the Meuse, battered their way through the French lines, and raced off to the sea. On the 16th of December 1944, the Germans launched a surprise attack against the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes. The Germans had assembled a powerful armored concentration to perform this attack. The 5th Panzer Army had 4 panzer divisions, the Armored Führerbegleitbrigade Brigade, and 5 infantry divisions. The 6th Panzer Army had 4 panzer divisions, 1 motorized Panzer Grenadier Division, Skorzeni's disguised 150th Panzer Brigade, and 6 infantry divisions. Lastly, the 7th Army had 1 Panzer Grenadier Division, the Armored Führer Grenadier Brigade, and 7 infantry divisions. The Allied intelligence services had picked up some signals about an upcoming attack, but did not realize the scale and vastness of the Waakt am Rhein. And they thought that the Germans were not even capable of launching such a big offensive. So therefore, all indications were ignored. Also in 1944, the SHAEF was slow to fully understand the situation and respond accordingly. Now let's talk about the differences, and let's start with the Germans. The fuel situation. In 1940, Germany had enough fuel stocks available to launch Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Also, Romania supported Germany with oil, and due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the USSR, the Soviet Union provided Germany with oil as well. German supply services handed out jerry cans to the panzer divisions on the march to the front, enabling them to top the fuel tanks before crossing into the Ardennes. The Luftwaffe also airdropped fuel containers on some occasions. In 1944, as you probably will know, the Germans had severe fuel shortages, and this handicapped the German army. The Germans hoped to capture Allied fuel dumps to keep their panzers rolling. So we see Joachim Peiper rumbling through the Ardennes searching for fuel in 1944. To make matters worse, the steel beasts of the Panzerwaffe in 1944 were very different from those of 1940. In 1940, the German panzer divisions were still mostly equipped with light tanks. The most numerous tank in service was the Panzer II. It and other light models such as the Panzer I, Panzer 35T and 38T accounted for about 75% of the tanks in the field. The bigger Panzer III and IV were still a minority. Now, these light tanks were obviously less effective in the field, but they did have an advantage because they consumed less fuel. In 1944, the 2 main tanks of the Panzerwaffe were the late model Panzer IV-J and the Panther. Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Leibstandarte-Division received a battalion of the supersized Tiger IIs. The STUG-3 was also a common sight in 1944, as was the Panzer IV-70. The latter was a tank hunter based on the Panzer IV chassis with the L-70 gun of the Panther. It was the standard vehicle in the Panzerjägerabteilung of most of the panzer divisions involved. Now, these German armored vehicles were significantly stronger than those of 1940, but the downside of this was that they needed way more fuel to keep them rolling. The Germans were short on petrol in 1944. They needed more but had to do with less. Let's discuss the bridges, because bridges are also very important to keep your advance going. Well, intact bridges. Several rivers run through the Ardennes, mostly from south to north. An attack from Germany heading west has to cross multiple waterways like the Ourthe, Lesse, Amblève, Salm and several smaller streams before reaching the Meuse. In both instances, enemy engineers blew up nearly all the bridges, because Belgian and American units had sufficient engineer units in the area. The Belgian demolitions of 1940 were pre-planned and also included zones of felled trees, roadblocks and cratered roads. May 1940 was a dry period that had resulted in low levels of water, and thus, in several instances, the Germans were able to cross the rivers, not through the bridges because these had been blown up, but just through the river themselves, for example at the Ourthe. The Germans also brought along bridging equipment and rubber boats. As mentioned before, the Panzer divisions in 1940 had different equipment than those in 1944. As mentioned before, a lot of German vehicles in 1940 were rather light. A Panzer II weighed less than 9 tons, a Panzer III about 23 tons, a Panther tank weighed 45 tons, a Target II 70 tons, and a Panzer IV 70 26 tons. This meant that the lighter vehicles of 1940 could also cross smaller, weaker bridges or a simpler and lighter platoon bridge built by pioneers. And often bridges weren't even needed. In 1940, the vanguard of the attack consisted of the Panzeraufklärungsabteilungen and Kratzschutzabteilungen of the Panzer divisions. The first is a reconnaissance battalion with armored cars, motorcycles and a few light guns. The second is a motorcycle battalion with, you guessed it, motorcycles and a few light support weapons. A lot of gear including motorcycles, MG34s, 8cm mortars and PAK-36 and the 7.5cm leichtes Infanteriegeschütz 18 guns could have been ferried across a stream on a simple raft or rubber boat. By 1944, the Kratzschutzabteilungen did no longer exist and the Panzeraufklärungsabteilungen were now fully equipped with armored cars and the SDKFZ 250 armored half-tracks. Rivers and streams were a bigger problem in 1944 than they were in 1940. Now let's discuss the Allies. Now, in both cases, 1940 and 1944, the Ardennes sector was lightly defended, but there were big differences. The Belgian army concentrated its defenses in 1940 on the Albert Canal and the Meuse River. In a second stage, it would withdraw to the Dyle River KW line. The bulk of the force was concentrated in this area, protecting the Belgian heartland and capital. The Ardennes was a sparsely populated region and of lower economic value. It is also a fairly small strip between Germany. Consequently, it is of greater strategic value for the defense of France than it was for the defense of Belgium. On the 10th of May, the Ardennes were defended by Groupement Caillards. This was a temporary battle group the size of an army corps, consisting of a motorized 1st Cavalry Division, the 1st Chasseurs Ardennais Division, the Chasseurs Ardennais Motorcycle Battalion, 2 extra engineer battalions, 2 extra artillery battalions, and 2 AAA batteries. This front was strung out across a 100-kilometer front from Spa to Arlon. So as you can imagine it was stretched out very thin. By contrast, in 1944, the US had 6 divisions in the same area, the 9th Armored Division and the 2nd, 99th, 106th, 28th and 4th Infantry Division. Still not a lot, but more than what the Belgians had. Their mission was also very different from one another. The Americans were dug in and tasked to hold this part of the line. That was not the case for the Belgians. They were not to stand and fight. Their mission was simply to delay the German advance with skirmishes and obstructions and to buy time for the French at the Meuse River. Their units were needed north and the French were already in their positions at the extended Maginot Line at the Meuse. The Belgians also didn't have the forces necessary to truly oppose the Germans. Several clashes occurred between the Chasseurs Ardennais and the German spearheads near several places. In all 3 cases, there was but one Belgian company defending the area. They succeeded in delaying the German advance, but they could not stop it. As I mentioned earlier, the French infantry was already dug in behind the Meuse, except for the units that moved north into Belgium to occupy the zone between Namur and Givet. The French cavalry moved into the Ardennes to further screen their infantry. 4 light cavalry divisions and 2 cavalry brigades of the French 9th and 2nd armies moved into the Belgian Ardennes. These were mixed divisions with one cavalry brigade and one motorized brigade. They did have some light tanks and armored cars, about 44 armored vehicles each, plus some other supporting weaponry. However, they did not possess the firepower to truly oppose the German panzers. They had only 24 field guns in its artillery battalion. The Americans, by contrast, reinforced the Ardennes with stronger units such as the 7th and 10th Armored and 82nd and 101st Airborne. Also, the French in the Ardennes in 1940, they weren't dug in. They just moved into the area. The American troops could also count on significantly more firepower. The light Belgian and French troops had little artillery support. By contrast, the 2nd and 99th US Infantry at Elsenborn Ridge were supported by a lot of artillery. The dense artillery fire was crucial in halting the Germans. There was also plenty of US armor support in the region. The 9th, 7th and 10th Armored Divisions were present, as were many tank destroyer battalions. In short, the US Army had way more firepower and were thus able to stop the Germans before they reached the Meuse. In 1940, the Germans, they brushed aside the French cavalry as they reached the Meuse. As the French did not expect an attack in this region, many of the infantry units present were not crack troops. For example, the 55th and 71st French infantry divisions were category B troops with older men and inferior equipment. Many of these were veterans of the First World War, and they had survived that war and were not willing to perish in this fight. A big advantage for the Germans was the strength of the Luftwaffe. The bombers acted as flying artillery, beating down the French defenders. The aerial bombardment was crucial in undermining the French morale and resilience, as well as in silencing the French artillery. The artillery was the strongest asset in the French hands that was able to stop the German river crossings. The German fighters kept the air clear of Allied aircraft and halted several Allied attempts at bombing the German pontoon bridges. By 1944, it was the Allies that ruled the skies in the west. The Germans intentionally attacked in a period of bad weather to avoid the dreaded Allied bombers. But when the skies cleared, the Allied bombers came in. The German disadvantages and the Allied advantages compared to 1940 allowed the US to delay the Panzer Spear Heights long enough to bring in Montgomery's and Patton's units to launch a counterattack. As soon as the weather cleared, the Allied air power unleashed its full might. And at this point, the Battle of the Bulge was lost for the Germans. Many thanks to Jeroen Bonte, who basically did the research for this episode. Actually, the first episode I did not research myself. So Jeroen, thank you so much for that. Did you know that simultaneously in 1944 the Germans also launched Operation Nordwind, a forgotten German offensive? I covered it right here. Thank you so much for watching, and I see you later.